What if I told you there's a tree growing right now in some of the poorest regions on Earth that produces pure diesel fuel? Not biodiesel, not ethanol, not some experimental biofuel that only works in a laboratory. Pure diesel, the kind that runs trucks, generators, trains, and jet engines. A tree so powerful that Air New Zealand flew a commercial aircraft with its fuel. Indian Railways ran diesel trains on it. Mercedes-Benz tested it in their engines and confirmed it works perfectly. The United Nations promoted it. The World Bank funded it. Goldman Sachs invested millions in it, and then it disappeared. Overnight. Projects worth billions of dollars were abandoned. Plantations covering millions of acres were left to rot. Government programs that were changing the energy future of entire nations were quietly shut down. Media outlets that once celebrated this tree as the solution to the global energy crisis suddenly started publishing articles calling it a failure. And the $3 trillion petroleum industry breathed a sigh of relief, because they almost lost everything. This is the story of Jatropha curcas, the diesel tree, a plant that can produce free fuel for 50 years straight, a plant that grows in dead soil where nothing else survives, a plant that could have freed the poorest nations on Earth from energy poverty forever, and the story of how it was buried. Not by nature, not by science, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you is one of the most shocking suppression stories of the 21st century, and every single word of it is documented. Before we talk about Jatropha, I need to tell you about another tree, because this is where the story actually begins, and it begins with a Nobel Prize. In 1980, a chemist named Melvin Calvin won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work on photosynthesis. Calvin spent decades studying how plants convert sunlight into energy, and during his research, he discovered something that would haunt the petroleum industry for the next 40 years. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, there's a tree called Copaifera langsdorffii. The locals call it the diesel tree, and they call it that for a very simple reason. When you drill a hole into the trunk of this tree, a golden liquid pours out. Not sap, not resin. A hydrocarbon fluid so chemically similar to petroleum diesel that you can pour it directly into the fuel tank of a diesel engine. No refining. No chemical processing, no modification to the engine. You drill the tree, you collect the liquid, you pour it in the tank, and the engine runs. Melvin Calvin documented this extensively. He calculated that a single Copaifera tree can produce 40 to 60 liters of this natural diesel per harvest. He published his findings. He gave lectures. He told the world that the Amazon rainforest was literally growing fuel. The petroleum industry ignored him. Calvin died in 1997. His research on the diesel tree was quietly shelved. The oil industry continued drilling. The Amazon continued burning. And most people never heard the name Copaifera langsdorffii. But Calvin had planted a seed, not a physical one, an idea. The idea that trees could replace oil wells. And that idea found its ultimate expression in a plant called Jatropha curcas. Jatropha curcas is not a pretty plant. It is not exotic. It does not look special. If you walked past it on the side of a road in rural Africa or India, you would not give it a second glance. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. Dangerous to a $3 trillion industry that depends on you believing there is no alternative to petroleum. Here is what Jatropha does. It grows in arid, semi-desert conditions where food crops die. It grows in poor, degraded soil that conventional agriculture has abandoned. It grows in regions with as little as 250 millimeters of rainfall per year. For context, that is less rain than the Sahara Desert gets in some regions. It does not compete with food crops because it thrives in land that is useless for farming. Let me say that again, because it is critical. Jatropha does not take food land away from people. It grows exactly where food cannot grow. Once planted, a Jatropha tree begins producing seeds within 2 to 3 years. Those seeds contain 27 to 40% oil by weight. That oil can be converted into biodiesel through a simple chemical process called transesterification. This process requires methanol and a basic catalyst like sodium hydroxide. Both are cheap and widely available. The resulting fuel meets international diesel standards. It burns cleaner than petroleum diesel. It produces fewer particulate emissions. It is biodegradable. And it is carbon neutral because the tree absorbs CO2 while growing the same CO2 that is released when the fuel is burned. 1 hectare of Jatropha, that is about 2.5 acres, can produce between 1,500 and 2,000 liters of biodiesel per year, every year, for 40 to 50 years, without replanting. Let me put that in perspective for you. A small village in rural Africa with 10 hectares of otherwise useless wasteland planted with Jatropha could produce 15,000 to 20,000 liters of diesel fuel every single year. Enough to power generators for electricity, enough to run water pumps for irrigation, enough to fuel vehicles for transportation to markets and hospitals, for free, from trees, on land that was doing nothing. No oil company, no pipeline, no refinery, no tanker ships crossing oceans, no geopolitical wars over oil fields, no OPEC, no price manipulation, just seeds falling from trees, year after year after year. Now ask yourself a very simple question. If you were running a $3 trillion petroleum empire and someone showed you this plant, what would you do? What happened next is one of the most dramatic rises and falls in modern agricultural history. And understanding it is the key to understanding why you have never heard of this plant. In the early 2000s, the world was facing a perfect storm. Oil prices were skyrocketing. Climate change was dominating headlines. Governments were desperate for alternatives to fossil fuels. The Iraq War had exposed how dangerous it was for nations to depend on petroleum from politically unstable regions. And then scientists and agricultural experts started talking about Jatropha. The pitch was irresistible. A plant that produces diesel fuel, grows on wasteland, does not compete with food, survives drought, produces for 50 years, a carbon neutral, simple to process, works in existing engines. It sounded too good to be true, but study after study confirmed it was real, and the money started flowing. India launched one of the most ambitious biofuel programs in human history. The Indian government announced plans to plant Jatropha on 11 million hectares of wasteland across the country. 11 million hectares. The goal was to produce enough biodiesel to replace 20% of India's petroleum diesel consumption. The program was backed by the Planning Commission of India and supported by multiple government ministries. Indian Railways conducted real-world tests running diesel trains on Jatropha biodiesel blends. The trains ran perfectly. The engines showed no damage. The emissions were lower than petroleum diesel. Or Indian Railways announced plans to eventually run its entire fleet on Jatropha fuel. China launched its own massive program. The Chinese government invested billions of yuan in Jatropha plantations across the southern provinces. By 2007, China had planted over 2 million hectares of Jatropha. The stated goal was energy independence from foreign oil. In Africa, the excitement was even more intense. For the first time in history, African nations saw a path to energy independence that did not require them to beg for foreign aid or submit to the geopolitical demands of oil-producing nations. Mozambique partnered with European investors to develop massive Jatropha plantations. Tanzania launched government-backed programs. Mali began village-level Jatropha projects that allowed rural communities to produce their own fuel for the first time ever. Ghana, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Madagascar all followed. The World Bank funded Jatropha initiatives across the developing world. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization promoted it as a tool for poverty reduction. The European Union included Jatropha biodiesel in its renewable energy directives. And then the big money arrived. Goldman Sachs invested in biofuel companies working with Jatropha. BP, the petroleum giant itself, invested in Jatropha research, not because they believed in it, because they were terrified of being left behind if it succeeded. In 2008, Air New Zealand conducted a historic test flight. A Boeing 747 took off from Auckland International Airport with one of its 4 engines running entirely on Jatropha-based jet fuel. The flight was a complete success. The engine performed flawlessly. The fuel met every aviation safety standard. The media went crazy. Headlines around the world declared that the age of oil was ending, that a humble plant growing on wasteland in Africa and India was about to overthrow the most powerful industry on the planet. Jatropha Curcas was on the cover of magazines. It was the subject of TED Talks. It was being called the Green Gold Rush, the plant that would save the planet. And then something happened. Something that nobody saw coming. Or maybe something that certain people had been planning all along. Between 2009 and 2013, nearly every major Jatropha project on Earth collapsed. India's 11 million hectare program was quietly scaled back. Then scaled back again. Then effectively abandoned. Government funding dried up. Farmers who had planted Jatropha on the government's promise of guaranteed income were left with worthless fields. China's program stalled, plantations were abandoned, state media stopped talking about Jatropha almost overnight. In Africa, project after project failed. European investors pulled their money out, plantations were left to the weeds. Communities that had been promised energy independence were left with nothing but broken promises and unused land. The media narrative flipped completely. The same outlets that had celebrated Jatropha as the savior of the planet now published articles calling it a scam, a failure, a pipe dream. Journalists wrote that Jatropha yields had been wildly overestimated, that the plant was too unreliable, that it was never going to work at scale. And most people accepted that narrative. They shrugged and moved on. Just another green technology that didn't pan out. Just another hype cycle that burned investors and disappointed the world. But here is what those articles did not tell you. They did not tell you that the American Petroleum Institute spent over $300 million per year lobbying the United States Congress. $300 million every single year, exposed in public lobbying records that anyone can verify. They did not tell you that between 2008 and 2012, the oil industry spent over $1 billion lobbying against the renewable fuel standard in the United States alone. While $1 billion fighting a single piece of legislation that would have mandated the blending of biofuels, including Jatropha biodiesel, into the national fuel supply. They did not tell you that oil industry-funded think tanks published dozens of reports questioning the viability of biofuel crops, reports that were then cited by journalists as independent research. When they were anything but independent, they did not tell you that when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, petroleum prices crashed. And when petroleum prices crash, biofuel projects become economically uncompetitive overnight, not because the technology failed, but because the price of the competing product suddenly dropped below the cost of production. And they certainly did not tell you that oil prices crashed, in part because OPEC deliberately increased production. A strategy that OPEC has used repeatedly throughout history to destroy competing energy technologies before they can gain a foothold in the market. This is not conspiracy theory, this is documented economic history. OPEC's own meeting minutes and public statements confirm that maintaining market share against alternative fuels has been a strategic priority for decades. So let me paint the full picture for you. A plant that produces free diesel fuel on wasteland was gaining momentum across the developing world. Billions of dollars were being invested. Governments were backing it. Airlines were flying with it. Train networks were running on it. The United Nations and World Bank were promoting it. And then the oil industry lobbied against biofuel mandates. Oil prices were crashed to make biofuels uncompetitive. Industry-funded reports questioned Jatropha's viability. Investors got scared and pulled their money. Projects lost funding. Plantations were abandoned. And the media declared it a failure. The tree did not fail. The system crushed it. And there is proof. Because some projects did not collapse. And what happened in those projects tells the real story. While the billion-dollar corporate Jatropha plantations were collapsing one by one, something remarkable was happening in the places nobody was watching. In the small West African nation of Mali, a non-profit organization called Mali Biocarburant SA had been quietly running a village-level Jatropha program since 2007. They did not take money from Goldman Sachs. They did not partner with BP. They did not plant millions of hectares of monoculture plantations designed to produce fuel for export to wealthy nations. They did something much simpler. They gave out Jatropha seeds to local farmers. They taught them how to plant the trees along the borders of their existing food crop fields. The Jatropha served as a living fence that kept animals out of their crops, while simultaneously producing oil-rich seeds. The farmers harvested the seeds, pressed them in simple hand-operated oil presses, and used the raw oil to power diesel generators that provided electricity to their villages for the first time in history. No refinery, no chemical plant, no billion-dollar investment, just farmers, seeds, and a hand press. And it worked. It is still working today, right now. As you watch this video, there are villages in Mali producing their own fuel from Jatropha trees that were planted over 15 years ago. Those trees are still producing seeds. Those seeds are still producing oil. And those villages have electricity because of it. The same story played out in rural Tanzania. Small-scale farmers organized into cooperatives planted Jatropha on degraded land surrounding their villages. They pressed the oil locally. They used it to power water pumps that irrigated their food crops. The leftover seed cake after oil extraction was used as organic fertilizer for their fields. Every part of the plant was used. Nothing was wasted. A study published in the journal Energy for Sustainable Development documented these small-scale programs and found something that completely contradicts the mainstream narrative about Jatropha. The plant works. It produces oil. That oil works as fuel. The economics work at the village level. What failed was not Jatropha. What failed was the industrial plantation model, the model designed by corporations and investors who wanted to grow Jatropha on millions of hectares like a factory crop and export the fuel to wealthy nations for profit. That model required massive upfront investment. It required perfect growing conditions across enormous areas. It required yields that newly planted trees on marginal land could not immediately deliver. When yields in the first few years were lower than the corporate projections promised, investors panicked. They pulled their money. Projects collapsed. The media declared the entire concept dead. But the village model, the model where local communities grow Jatropha for their own use, where the fuel stays in the community that produced it, where the economics do not need to satisfy Wall Street profit expectations. That model never failed. Because it was never designed to make billionaires richer, it was designed to give poor communities free energy. And free energy is the one thing the global energy industry cannot allow. Think about this. The entire petroleum economy is built on one fundamental principle. Energy must be bought. It must be purchased from someone who controls the supply, whether that is an oil company, a gas station, an electric utility, or an OPEC nation. The entire system depends on you paying for energy every single day of your life. A tree that produces free fuel for 50 years in your backyard breaks that model completely, permanently, irreversibly. You cannot put a meter on a tree. You cannot install a pump at a Jatropha grove and charge per liter. You cannot build a pipeline from a farmer's field to a stock exchange. You cannot create futures contracts and derivatives and financial instruments around seeds falling from trees in a village in Mali. And if you cannot financialize it, you cannot control it. And if you cannot control it, the $3 trillion energy industry considers it a threat, not because it doesn't work, because it does. Remember Melvin Calvin, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist who discovered the diesel tree in the Amazon, the one whose research was quietly shelved after he died. Copaifera langsdorffii is still there, still growing, still producing natural diesel fuel from its trunk. In recent years, researchers in Brazil have returned to Calvin's work. A study from the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro confirmed that Copaifera sap is composed primarily of hydrocarbons in the sesquiterpene family. These molecules are structurally almost identical to the hydrocarbons found in petroleum diesel. The researchers confirmed what Calvin said decades ago. You can pour this sap directly into a diesel engine and it runs. One mature Copaifera tree produces approximately 40 to 60 liters of this natural diesel per tapping. The tree can be tapped multiple times per year without damage. It lives for hundreds of years, and it regenerates its fuel supply naturally through photosynthesis. Now, let me say that again so it really sinks in. This tree takes sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide from the air and converts them into diesel fuel, inside its own trunk, using nothing but biology, no drilling, no fracking, no offshore platforms, no oil spills, no wars, no carbon emissions beyond what the tree already absorbed while growing. A single acre of Copaifera trees could theoretically produce enough fuel to power a small farm indefinitely, for generations, for centuries, and yet you have never heard of it. Calvin's research papers are available in university libraries. The Brazilian studies are published in scientific journals. The tree grows in the Amazon right now. Well, nobody is hiding it behind a locked door, but nobody is promoting it either. Nobody is funding large-scale Copaifera plantations. Nobody is running news segments about the tree that bleeds diesel. Nobody is teaching it in schools. Because the moment this knowledge becomes mainstream, the moment ordinary people realize that trees can produce fuel for free, the entire economic foundation of the fossil fuel industry begins to crack. So let me bring this full circle. 2 trees, 2 different species, both producing diesel fuel from sunlight and biology alone. Jatropha curcas, proven in laboratories, tested in jet engines, used in railway trains, endorsed by the United Nations, funded by the World Bank, confirmed by over 3,000 published studies, still producing fuel today in villages across Africa and Asia. Copaifera langsdorffii, discovered by a Nobel Prize winner, confirmed by Brazilian researchers, produces fuel so pure you can pour it directly into an engine, lives for hundreds of years, grows in the Amazon rainforest, and yet the world still burns petroleum, still fights wars over oil, still pumps carbon into the atmosphere at a rate that is altering the climate of the entire planet, still allows the poorest nations on Earth to remain trapped in energy poverty when the solution is literally growing in the ground beneath their feet. The petroleum industry is worth $3 trillion per year. $3 trillion. That is $3,000 billion flowing through the global economy every single year, into the hands of oil companies, oil-producing nations, refineries, pipeline operators, and the financial institutions that profit from all of it. That $3 trillion depends on one single belief, the belief that there is no alternative, the belief that fossil fuels are the only practical source of energy, the belief that nothing else works at scale. Jatropha proved that belief wrong, and it was crushed, not by science, not by nature, by money, by lobbying, by market manipulation, and by a media narrative that declared failure before the trees had even reached maturity. But the trees are still there, still growing, still producing seeds, still producing oil. In villages across Mali and Tanzania and India, farmers are still pressing Jatropha seeds and pouring free fuel into their generators. The trees do not care about stock prices. They do not care about OPEC meetings. They do not care about lobbying budgets or media narratives. They just grow and they produce fuel year after year, decade after decade. The petroleum age will end eventually, not because the oil will run out, but because one day enough people will realize that the alternative was always there, growing quietly on the side of the road, waiting to be planted, waiting to be harvested, waiting to set them free. Some knowledge is too dangerous to promote, so it gets buried. But buried things have a way of growing back, especially when they are trees. If this video made you see the energy industry differently, share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next video reveals another material that was suppressed for decades, something even more shocking than what you just watched. And if you made it this far in the video, drop the word Jatropha in the comments, so I know you watched until the end. I read every single comment. I will see you in the next one.